Now, the traditional method of dating sedimentary rock strata, and on which the current datings are still largely presumed, is a very interesting procedure. It begins with the assumption that what is happening today has always happened for millions of years without any appreciable change, and yet they carefully ignore, almost deny the existence of the great many examples of rapid and massive strata deposition we witness around the world even today. It's called the uniformitarian theory, and is based on, well, nothing but presumption, actually. There is no factual basis for this idea. It is simply presumed that geological change always happens very slowly. But they actually have no way of knowing that. It's just an idea, an assumption, a theory. By the way, as with most things, the secular scientific community is very divided on this issue also, and many hold to an opposite theory called catastrophism, in which they believe that the geological landscape of today is the result of a series of major, sometimes worldwide, catastrophic events over time. But fundamentally, the traditional process goes something like this. Having arbitrarily decided the rate at which rock strata is laid down based on no more than a mere presumption, they measure, then arbitrarily calculate the age of certain sets of strata. Then they choose a few of the rarer fossils from these strata and call them index fossils. Then they go around the world, and wherever they find those fossils, they arbitrarily assume the strata is the same age, based on another as yet unproven theory or assumption called the theory of evolution. Again, presuming without any factual basis that the same fossils can only mean the strata represents the same arbitrarily defined stage of evolution. So what you have is a totally arbitrary and unproven presumption about the age of the strata being used to support the presumed age of the fossils found in them, which are in turn used to arbitrarily determine the age of any strata the fossils are found in. Now, even the geologists and paleontologists, to their credit, are starting to scratch their heads over this obvious, fundamental and classical error of circular logic upon which so much presumption has been based. Now, the relatively new technology of radiometric dating, which uses the rate of radioactive decay of certain elements as a sort of natural clock to try and establish the age of certain objects, is proving spectacularly unreliable on objects of an already known age, and wildly inconsistent on objects of an unknown age. In short, we do not actually know how old or young the rocks and fossils really are for a fact. We have no reliable way of determining it. Certain people have simply made a whole lot of arbitrary and highly questionable assumptions about it. But what would we expect to find today if there had been a worldwide, rapidly moving flood? We'd expect to find not a nice even layer of mud and silt neatly deposited around the world with a sign saying this is the flood strata. To begin with, we would find that apart from different layers from different stages of the flood, as discussed in the last session, sediment would also collect in valleys and at the bottom of slopes, but not so much along ridges and mountain tops and so forth. These layers would vary considerably from place to place in rock type, depending on the sort of rock types that were in the area to begin with, to be picked up and redeposited by the flood. Their shapes, sizes, patterns, and so forth would be many and varied, depending on how the water flowed around and over the pre-flood terrain. In short, it would not be a uniform layer blanketing the world, but made up of many different pockets of strata, of a great many differing thicknesses and consistency, mineral makeup and so forth, depending on the local geography and water movement patterns, much as we find in the geological column that is spread out around the world. We would expect instances where multiple strata are all bent and folded at once, without snapping or crushing as solidified rock would. Similarly, we would expect multiple strata also to be tilted or sheared by a single geological event. Now, before I explain why, it should be pointed out that it is clear the frequently found cases of bends and folds across multiple strata can only occur in a single event after all of the strata have first been laid horizontally, and while they are in a pliable state. Otherwise they would snap and shatter. Likewise, fractures or faults or tilting or multiple strata can only occur in a single event after all of the strata have been laid horizontally. Sediment layers are deposited horizontally because of their waterborne nature. Now, why would we expect a worldwide flood to leave many instances of bent, folded, tilted and sheared strata? Because a flood of such magnitude would place enormous and dynamic geological forces upon the Earth's crust, which, quite literally, floats on what amounts to a great lake of fire. The mantle of hot molten rock upon which the continental tectonic plates of the Earth float. Now, as the tsunami-like flood spread out across the land, billions of tons of water progressively begin to press down on the various parts of the tectonic plates. But it is not until the flood is well established that these pressures begin to be evenly spread. But the Earth being a sphere means that pushing the plates down also pushes them together, causing enormous lateral compression forces. Compression forces lead to buckling, tilting and compression fractures or faults in various places of the sedimentary layers already laid down by the flood while they are still pliable. Some might even be overlaid by subsequent horizontal sedimentation layers, as is often found. Now, as the floodwater recedes, dynamic uneven pressures will return briefly as the various areas drain at different rates, the last being the oceans themselves. Now finally, as the weight of billions of tons of water are progressively removed, there will be an upward movement of the tectonic plates. Again, as the Earth is a sphere, this will try and pull apart the tectonic plates and will create enormous lateral tension forces, pulling the plates apart where it can and creating tension faults and fractures and increasing volcanic activity as magma finds new pathways opening up to the surface. We would find in these sedimentary strata, first, the organisms that were the first victims of the flood. Fixed or heavy organisms, e.g. low or small vegetation not ripped away, corals anchored, shellfish and so on. Underground dwellers, slow movers, simple and small organisms, insects and so forth. Then we'd find those that managed to escape for longer, or float or swim for longer. Those that might sink fast might get embedded first. Those that floated or sunk slowly would be embedded later, and so forth. Those that were swept away by or escaped from the rising floodwaters might be drawn back and embedded later as the waters receded. In short, you might end up with a fossil distribution that could be mistaken for an evolutionary pattern, but in reality is more likely to be the sort of natural distribution you might expect from a flood. Other things you might expect to find are great accumulated masses of floating vegetation and animal debris here and there that later become coal seams. Marine fossils spread out far beyond the marine environment. Mass accumulations of animal bodies, often of many species, that later become rich but localized fossil beds. You will find many exceptions to the general pattern of fossil distribution. You would find wide, shallow, sediment-filled alluvial valleys, large, near-flat or slightly undulating sedimentary alluvial plains and tableland areas, expansive coastal plains and river deltas, randomly distributed human artefacts of unexpected levels of technology. In other words, what you would find is the world you and I live in. In short, there is a far, far better and far, far more logically consistent case for considering the fossil record and the anomalous fossils and the geological column itself as evidence of the Great Flood than there is for arbitrarily assuming it is evidence of evolution. Now bear in mind also that there is one thing every single sedimentary fossil-bearing strata of the geological column has in common, and it's this: they were formed underwater. So when they discover the geological column exists all over the world, in almost every single place, it means that all over the world, almost every single place, at one time at least, was underwater.